Well, hello and welcome to World Architecture Festival 2021. We're about to have the first of 4 sessions devoted to subjects which will profoundly affect the way that architects and designers behave or respond to current global conditions. This is one of the parts of the WAFX program. And for those of you who are not aware of this, we started the WAFX program to mark the 10th anniversary of our festival back in 2017. And it's an awards program for all the shortlisted awards entries which are future projects, which are thinking about the future. And they can range from the hypothetical to projects which may already be on site. The key thing about it is that we identified 10 themes which seem to us to be significant for the future. And we make category awards, and then we make an overall winner. We've already announced the category awards for this year. We'll be announcing the overall winner on Friday evening. But we've got 4 sessions where we're picking up on some of the key themes. Jeremy Melvin, WAF curator, is here with me in the studio, and we're going to be discussing, after a presentation, the question about food and architecture, growing food in the city. And I'm delighted to welcome a friend of the festival, Vicente Guallart, founder and principal of Guallart Architects, who work across the world, particularly well known for their work in China. He's the founder of the Institute for Advanced Architecture of Catalonia, and I think for the purposes of today's discussion, just as important was his role as the chief architect of Barcelona for 4 or 5 years, in which he really re-envisaged the nature of what that wonderful city could be and what it would aspire to in the years to come. So welcome, Vicente, and over to you.
Thank you, Paul, for your introduction. So yeah, for me it's a pleasure to be here in this moment where we are facing a kind of crisis about the future. But every time that we need to think about the future, we should look into the past, where we are coming from, what make us to be humans, what are the things that we need to live. No? During these hard days of the pandemic, suddenly we realize what are the basic things that we need for living, and food obviously is one of them. Many times we didn't know where things were coming from, and I remember last year that suddenly some people that were kind of illegal immigrants working in some places in the middle of Spain, suddenly they become fundamental workers because they were providing food for the society. So today I will try to explain some of the projects I'm working based about the idea of the self-sufficiency, and most focus on self-sufficient production of food in the cities. Because there are several approaches about how to produce food in cities, and can be in the ground, can be in greenhouses, can be LAD farming, can be in vertical farming. So there are many approaches about that. And if we want to make an ecological wall, we need to approach the production to the place of consumption of anything. Doesn't make sense to produce a tomato in Brazil and to send with a container to Europe, or to produce even in Algeria or in Morocco and to send here to the continent. More and more, we have the possibility to start to produce things within the city. And here I would like to share 3 projects I did. Some years ago, I did a project in Valencia. Was a project related with social housing, but the place that they proposed us was a place that was not like that, but it was like an abandoned agriculture land. But the surroundings of Valencia is like this, and every time that the city grows, what it does is they bury the agriculture. It's not that they destroy, it's that literally they bury because the city is built 1 meter above about it. So what we were doing in this place was to study all these water channels that in Valencia were built by the Muslims more than 1,000 years ago. Muslims have been in Spain for more than 500 years. And then what I wanted was to be able to build social housing, but at the end to create, to use agriculture, but an urban agriculture as a kind of tool for the social integration and the social interaction. So this is the project where the buildings were defined around, and in the center there were some sport area and some agriculture area. So this was the initial idea that we have about where agriculture will become one social tool for, people spending their time, but also instead to have grass in the park, to have orange trees that has an incredible smell with the azar flower, and then some agriculture elements. We invite several architects. This building was by MVRDV, and there were other architects involved. We start the construction, and then the fantastic thing was that instead to make many asphalt and concrete, what we were doing was rebuild the water channel. The water are the information network that give life to agriculture and to trees and to nature. So after some years of crisis, in fact, this neighborhood survived because we were able to do these agriculture fields. We were planting the trees that are traditional in this area, like the palms. But you see, this is the park that is in the middle of this neighborhood with the water channels and then the agriculture. But this time the agriculture is not organized in a productive and industrial way, but every citizen that apply, they have like around 100 square meters, and they can produce a lot of food. So at this point, the urban space, the public space that you know that in Barcelona and in the Mediterranean is important, become an agriculture field, but an area that is organized and designed in order to promote this social interaction and at the same time to be able to produce food. We were also designing one of these greenhouses that in fact was done with the proper insulation and everything. So we create a meeting point using the traditional landscape elements that are in these areas. So that means that making agriculture as an element for the landscape is something we have been interested about. Another project that we did when I was chief architect of Barcelona, I was very much inspired by this Brooklyn Ranch, that is the biggest roof farm in America. I meet the president, that is Ben Flanner, and I invite him to come to Barcelona in order to see if we could produce some very big roof farm over there. So it was, we were looking where to do it, and then we found that at that moment was the project to transform this market in the Vall d'Hebron, and then we decided to use the rooftop of the market in order to do an urban farm. What is amazing, because then you can produce the food up there, you can even eat there or sell it down in the market. So there was at that time a competition that was won by Jordi Badia, and then, this building that had this metallic facade, but then we proposed to have a big rooftop with this kind of landscape. And the truth is that some years later, this is already done and this is working. So that means that this is the biggest roof farm in Spain. And the interesting thing is in the top of a market. No? So somehow we are even promoting the connection for the production and selling or eating. Another project or another situation I am interested is I was visiting Iceland, and in Iceland I found one of the most interesting places I have been in the last years. My son, in fact, found that they have a greenhouse, a big greenhouse, like almost 1 hectare, where they are producing tomatoes for more than 100,000 people. And because they have some geothermal energy, they are able to heat this space. But well, there is this incredible farm where they have a restaurant inside the farm. I asked my son, "Hey, how did you find it?" And he told me, I was, instead to look for best places in Iceland, he asked in Google the best unknown places in Iceland. And then he found this place, and we have an incredible meal of tomatoes. You can eat tomatoes in this rooftop of tomatoes. But I thought that if you can produce tomatoes in Iceland, you can produce anywhere. So I was also teaching in Moscow, and then with our students, we were proposing these ideas of having greenhouses, retrofitting some of these Khrushchevka neighborhoods in Moscow. And as you may know, you remember, because maybe I was explaining this project last year, we won that competition in China, where we have some solar green roof in these buildings, where citizens will be able to produce their own food, but also we integrate solar panels that using some kind of transparency, these solar panels will be able to produce energy and food in the rooftop of the buildings. And in the ground floor, again, we were proposing some kind of fresh food market. The interesting thing is that after winning this competition, you know that in our research place, the Institute for Advanced Architecture, we are focused very much on the digital technologies, but we are also focused very much now in the ecology. We have this research place that this is where I am right now. And then every year we do a small prototype of something that we are interested about the future. And then last year, in fact, we finished only 3 months ago, we decided to build a solar greenhouse. So with our students, we were designing a small prototype of a building that, because we were thinking that this could become a solution for the cities, will be vertical, will have 2 floors. Lower floor is more for the engineering and then growing the small seeds, and the upper part could be taller plants. And then in this case, the roof were following the direction of the sun. So we are working with a project and looking for how we could build this using and everything we could produce. But we were using basically timber that is in the forest around us. So with our students and researchers, we're producing all this structure. And then the result is this solar greenhouse that basically has in the roof, you see that we design and produce some panels with some degree of transparency. Some other glasses are transparent. We were working with some engineers from Almeria. Almeria is called they have the sea plastic. They are producing a lot of food using greenhouses. And then we developed the whole engineering in order to do something that seems to be very simple, like a greenhouse. In this case, this greenhouse was produced using, as I say, the timber and manipulated using CLT with our, I would say, tools here. So if you remember the pictures and the renders we were doing in China, this is very much connected with that. What we were doing was to do a real prototype in order to prove that what we were drawing in China can be finally produced. For the facade, well, there is a company here that is called Kricursa. They are one of the best glass companies in the world, and then they are our partners, and then they offer us some leftover of glasses for a building of Zaha Hadid in Hong Kong that is ultra clear glass, and then we were using this leftover. You see that the glass is it has some air in between because everything needs to be ventilated. So I would say that we were also introducing some LED in order to test how it will work if they will have more hours of let's say, light, in order to test how the production of food will be happening. The good news also is that the prototype was done, and now we are working in a building in Barcelona that we won last year, the competition, and we convinced the city council, and we are going to do a big version of this. So we'll have a solar greenhouse in the rooftop of the tallest timber building in Spain, that now we are finishing the project. So I would say that this idea of combining food production can have some impact in the life of people, can have some impact in the public space, but also in the architecture itself. There is a new typology that is this vertical farming that is very appropriate for cities and densities. And as I say, we want to approach the production of goods to the place where they will be consuming, and for any crisis in the future, to be able to produce food and energy in your building, this will be a great solution. So that's it. Thank you.
Vicente, thank you very much for that, and as stimulating as ever. And what's really interesting about our WAFX program is, I hope we think that it encourages and also celebrates the sort of thinking that you've just described, where it is possible that the creation of a prototype will be more important than the creation of conventional buildings or conventional structures in the usual way. And this needs to be known about. I'm going to ask Jeremy to make a comment about this relationship between research and prototyping and the wider world of sort of convention, and everything's too difficult to change and financial institutions are always nervous.
Well, financial institutions make a habit of being nervous, and they trade off it. They find ways of trading nervousness. But I think the very interesting thing about food in this context is that it's all the things you're talking about. It's about prototyping, it's about convention, it's about production, it's about exchanging. And that can happen in each of those cases, can happen in all sorts of different ways. I mean, food is a tradable commodity, and there are people who make a lot of money out of that. But also, it is fundamental, as Vicente showed, one of his first images was of people living in a cave, sharing a meal. It is absolutely fundamental to how we structure our relationships with other people, is over how we eat and how we eat together. So I think that food is a very, very interesting parallel. Well, it's not parallel because it's not a straight line, but it weaves through so much of other aspects of culture, which includes architecture and city making.
And Vicente, I wonder whether in the work that you've done in China and now what you're doing in Barcelona, this combination of residential accommodation and sort of urban agricultural production, does it require you as the architect also to design a management system, a social system? Do you have to sort of set out calendars and times of year? Or can you hand that over to the residents or the municipal authority?
Well, until now, we had a system still following the Le Corbusier idea, the buildings as the machine of living, where buildings were receiving resources from outside and didn't require any kind of management from the citizens. So we were receiving energy, we were receiving water, we are receiving food, we are receiving information. So I would say people are quite passive in the buildings. But now when we think on living as a service, the idea that buildings become places that are able to produce energy, to produce food, to recycle the water in order to do their own irrigation, and so many, even using 3D printers and so on. So that means that management need to be in the agenda in the building themselves. So in our case, in Barcelona, this will be a social housing building. Owner will be the city of Barcelona, and they are interested to discover how this will work because they never did it. You know, until now about the energy, there are the companies that are taking care about the management, and then citizens, maybe they can have an app and they can see how much energy is working, but in fact, this is not happening so much. About food, this will be different because the decision is, or the people living there, they do their own management and they produce food for themselves, or what we are doing is we are thinking that the agriculture that will be produced up there will be managed by someone else, and then with this food, they can sell, they can share. This will be for charity, or if this will be a private building, for example, you could give a concession. The owners of the building will get 50% of the food, and the people managing the upper part could be able to sell the rest. You know, agriculture and the use of land is very, very, very old tradition about the relationship between the law and the workers. No, there are many agreements in this use of the land and the production of food and so on. So I would say that the solution is not created yet. In Valencia, at the end is the city who is managing the whole land. They do a kind of lottery, and then if you get one piece of land, you can produce your food for yourself and you cannot sell it. But then I would say that what is happening is we are adding more services, and that means we are adding more complexity to the place where we live. And we are creating more resilience in future crises. Maybe the problem will be the food or the energy or whatever, and there will be more crises in the near future for sure. So I would say that to be able to produce food near where you live, I think will give more security for the future. We need to find the management tools, but there are several ways to do it, and architects need to be working with the managers or with the owners in order to see how big is the elevator that need to go to the rooftop and so on in order to make it, to make the things working well.
Yes, that's very interesting because, Jeremy, I mean, here in Britain, and I think London in particular, we have a long tradition of what are called allotments, which is land owned by the municipal authority, but where citizens can apply, and they do. They may have to wait many years until they have a chance to have a sort of lifetime lease on a piece of land where they can grow vegetables and fruit. This is extremely popular and was extremely popular during the sort of pandemic and lockdown. It was a place of retreat as well as production.
Well, I think it's very interesting how that happens in London, where there simply aren't enough allotments to go around for the people who want them. But there's also a very long tradition of that sort of way of living in other European cities. I'm thinking about Vienna, the immediate aftermath of the First World War, when there was a massive housing crisis. Many people, even quite poor people, had a little plot of land on the edge of the city where they could go for the summer, and they could grow a little bit of food. I mean, not perhaps enough to sustain them for the whole year, but at least to have some fresh food. And some of them built little shacks on those, and gradually they became residences because the pressure on housing in the centre of Vienna was so great. And that happened in other European cities. I'm not sure how universal it was. And I think there's a very interesting point here about the relationship, and it's something that Vicente has been alluding to, between food production and social justice, which is arguably, well, it's certainly one of the biggest of the issues that we face in cities in the developed world at least, is the inequitable distribution of space, of amenity, of access to transport. And I think and that includes access to food. And if we can think about food and social equity, we might actually begin to be able to relieve some of those other pressure points too.
Well, Vicente, perhaps you'd like to respond to that point about the extent to which cities, and you were involved in this idea of the future of Barcelona, as I remember it, rather than the city expanding into countryside, a notion that actually the countryside might start to expand into the city. And actually, as you were saying, the flows of food as well as flows of information would, in a sense, become more equitable. So that's one thing. And the other thing, I was very interested in in your point that actually greater complexity could provide greater resilience, which is not normally the way we think about it. We usually think that complexity means complication and confusion. But actually, I think you've made a very powerful case for why we should think differently about that.
You know, today, I would say that there are two approaches about the future of living, how we respond to this crisis. You know, many people with resources decide to live outside the city, no? And then when you live outside, this happened during the hard moments of the pandemic in New York and in many other cities, even here in Catalonia. And then when you are more in the countryside, it's much more easy to have access to the land and to the food and everything, you know, because this is where in general this has been produced. So one way to think about security in the future is to imagine that it's better that we go back to a more rural environment. This is one way to look at it. But the idea of inequality and how we find this inequality is to think exactly in the other way around. So to think that what we need to do is to transform our cities in order to be more innovative, more productive, more resilient, and adding these new layers of productivity. You know, in general, the rooftops of our buildings are kind of abandoned. At some point in the last year, we start to put solar panels, but just filling with solar panels without any meaning. Now in Barcelona, by the way, now we are approving a new regulation where the solar panels can create a pergola 3 meters above the roof. And then I was trying also that they approved that we can close it to produce food, but this didn't happen yet. But this means that adding new layers that can bring us to produce things is something fundamental. For example, some of the poorest neighborhoods in Barcelona, where are the problems with people that cannot afford, many cases immigrants cannot afford to pay the electricity, are places with these blocks from the 60s with flat roofs that will be super easy to place solar greenhouses. So I think that with the solar greenhouse, we approach two topics, that is the energy poverty and the food poverty, that this is based on this inequality that we can find in the cities. So I think that instead from the government to subsidize, to pay for the electricity to the big companies, what the government should be doing is to empower the local communities and empower the buildings to let them to produce their own energy and their own food. So instead to pay to the drug dealers, is to create yourself the resources in order to avoid to make the big companies even bigger. So this is based on the idea of the distributed city. No, instead to go from centralized city, the centralized economy, the big companies, we are moving to the distributed model of production of resources. And this is what I think is the future. The future is related with empowering the communities in order to make them productive. Because if not, this inequality between the Amazons that are selling you food, selling you whatever, cheaper, and you are always connected to the big machine, this is what will destroy the world. So I think that we need to start to distribute the capacity of making things, and from that point of view, food, energy, and resources are something that cities and buildings should produce again.
And what do you think is the appropriate scale of governance to undertake this? I mean, I'm thinking about the relationship between, let's say, districts in Barcelona. I remember we did a student competition in Sant Andreu with that marvelous 1930s modernism that Franco tried to destroy, but he didn't. He altered it, but he didn't destroy it. And kind of redundant factories there, and you could think of that as a district. Well, that could almost be a kind of autonomous unit. But then, what if that's right, and there are the series of units in relation to the city? But then, what is the relationship of the city, especially if it's a more distributed cluster, to the region? Now, you've been in municipal government. I mean, you understand the politics of this. Do you think that the idea of distribution can work with these different layers? It's almost a parallel to your layers of building, is the layers of government, going right up to, well, is it Barcelona? Is it Madrid? It's another series of layers. How close might we be to actually getting a working arrangement?
Yeah, you know, we cannot produce all the food that we need in cities. That's very obvious. And even we cannot, well, I become vegetarian, but there are many people also that are still eating meat. And then you cannot grow cows in the city. That's very obvious. So that's why, in general, I mean, the way the world is organized, the way Europe is organized, is that every city has some region around that provides ecological services, but also is providing the water. You have also farming. You have also places for production of energy. So I think that we need to plan many scales of the living. And obviously what happened is now we are only depending in general to the global scale in order, for example, to fabricate a car. If you want to have a car, you receive components from 20 countries. And this is part of the crisis that we have now. I read some news about making washing machines. They were receiving pieces from 15 countries, you know? So that means that today we are in almost everything depending on the global scale. So what we propose is that we should have several scales of dependency. And the first thing is we need to start to produce things as near as we can from the place where we live. And that means to bring back the production. You mentioned Sant Andreu. This used to be an industrial neighborhood. And now the industry went to the suburbia or to China. So from that point of view, there is the same discussion today. Now that we are talking that Europe become a continent of zero emissions, should we produce big solar fields in the agriculture land? In Catalonia, they want to cover some agriculture land with some solar panels. And I think that that's completely crazy. I mean, you can do in some cases, but it's better to do greenhouses that produce energy and produce food. But basically, what we need to do is to bring the production of energy to the cities at least 25%. No, it's not 100%, but it's to have some kind of control in the moment of the hard crisis. You will not be completely disconnected. So I would say that the solution on how to run the world is not only solved in one scale, that this is more or less how it's working today. We need to organize things in several scales. And I completely agree that the neighborhood of around 25,000 people is the traditional scale of the neighborhood, because this is the distance that people can be walking every day. And this is the size of the historical centers. If you see the historical center of Barcelona, Valencia, and well, many cities, even Vienna, they are like 1 kilometer, a square kilometer, more or less. This is the walking distance. So we can think on this kind of organization about neighborhoods of 25,000 people. Obviously, the city will provide some other services, and the region obviously will provide many other services. You know, cities need the countryside around. If cities will not need countryside around, we will live, all of us, in a single city of 500 million somewhere between Paris and London. And this doesn't work. So the way the world works is cities need the countryside around to have ecological services. And I think that, as you say, we need to have a good balance, good interaction between the city and the region.
Thank you. And Jeremy, this point about the relationship between global and local is one we've looked a lot at World Architecture Festival, because obviously at one level we are a global event. But I think our attitude has always been, what we're interested in is not how things are the same. We're interested in how things are different, and how, given local culture and climate and geography and history, architects and designers tackle the same problems, but they tackle them in their own way and produce very distinctive results.
I mean, that's obviously true at its best. I mean, there may have been a tendency in the second half of the 20th century to elide those differences. I think we've all moved back from that now and recognise not just the value and the quality of individual places, but the opportunities that different climates and different contexts allow. Like, you know, Iceland is basically a very, very cold, windy rock in the middle, or volcanic rock in the middle of the North Atlantic. But because of its geothermal power, it can produce tomatoes to feed its population. And they probably didn't have tomatoes until the 1960s. And even then they would have been imported. So I think that that's a very important point. But I also think that there's something about the way we consider the limits of cities. And I remember looking at a project or a teaching program Cedric Price was running about London many years ago at the Architectural Association. And I had just been reading Robert von Musil's novel, The Man Without Qualities, where he opens with a description of the weather systems in the Atlantic as a way of homing into Vienna. And I think that the equivalent now is, where does your food come from? Now, London takes a lot of food from Kenya, for example, for green beans. They have green beans all the year round. It takes pineapples from the Caribbean. And in some ways, that sets the limit of what London is. It's where the edges of its food consumption or its food production occurs. That's clearly insane. And we will have to adjust our eating habits as well as our transport habits in order to overcome that. But if we can look at all sorts of little micro ways of food production, we might be able to grow our own tomatoes all the year round because we can grow them in our kitchen windows or something like that. You know, so I think this relates to what Vicente is saying about complexity, that if we deal with a series of micro conditions, it is by definition complex, but it may then have the resilience which overly designed complexity doesn't have.
Yes, because it's the aggregate of micro conditions which then obviously make a larger picture. Vicente, do you feel alarmed, optimistic, encouraged by the sort of directions that you see this emerging complexity going in, or do you feel that actually there are just a few people in the world like you who are kind of really grappling with this, and it's going to be tough, tough, tough?
You know, next year will be 10 years when I wrote that book, The Self-Sufficient City. At that moment, I was very optimistic because I thought that this is the idea that we produce, again, things in cities. We approach the production of food, energy, and things, and so on, should be done in a positive way when we are still alive, when we have the opportunity to choose. But now, because I see that the world is not reacting, no, you see what's happening in Glasgow and so on. Now I feel that there is some kind of collapse arriving soon, and then maybe this will be, in any case, the solution, but will be developed in a more situation of crisis, no? So, from my point of view, the idea that we start producing energy and things near the place where we live is a good ecological future. And this can be done in a positive way and preparing ourselves for harder conditions in the future, or we'll be doing this fast and dirty because there will be some kind of crisis, no? So I would say that I am not so much optimistic as I was 10 years ago, because at that time, you know, in Barcelona, we had that mantra, we need to organize the cities with productive neighborhoods and in a zero emissions metropolis, and everyone told us that that was impossible. Today, the zero emissions continent is the official mantra for Europe, you know. I would say what things seems to be impossible, 10 years later become the new normal. So from that point of view, what I would like to see is we do this in a positive way and not running because time is finished.
Well, that's a great way to end this session. Thank you so much for your presentation. I've used the phrase relentless optimism as a characteristic of good architects and designers, and you're a wonderful example of that. Thank you very much, Vicente, and we hope to see you soon.
Thank you, Paul and Jeremy. Thank you. Bye.